One trend I see video game developers jumping on these days is remakes. It seems every year there are several remakes being released, whether they're remakes of games from huge franchises or remakes of lesser known titles. It seems like in the past few years we've had more remakes coming out than at any other point in gaming history. First off, let me clarify what I'm referring to by the term remake, because this often gets confused with so many other terms like remaster, reboot, or even port. When I refer to remakes, I am referring to taking an old game and completely recreating it from scratch. This would be like basically taking an old car and then using it as a model to make a new car based off of the old one. Some remakes might even be like taking an old car and completely restoring it with new parts and cosmetics. A remaster would be like taking an old, or apparently not very old, game and then upscaling the resolution and textures. Maybe add some bonus features or extra modes. This is kind of just like slapping a new coat of paint on an old car, but changing nothing else. Or spraying air freshener on some old junk to mask the putrid smell. Reboots would be like making a new game that is loosely based off an old game, but is meant to essentially reset the story and begin to tell a new one using the familiar story elements and characters from the old. This would be like making an old car that is based on a familiar design of an older car, but looks completely different with only a few recognizable attributes. Now, port would just be taking a game that was only accessible on one console and re-optimizing and re-releasing it for another. This would be like taking a car directly from Japan and then shipping it to the USA. What has caused this uprise in remakes? There are three reasons to me why I think remakes have been more abundant in recent years. First, there's just a much larger market to sell to. Video games are way more popular than they used to be. With the rise of streamers and the lockdowns from the pandemic a few years ago, everybody and their dog decided to become a gamer. I remember when I used to be made fun of in school for being a gamer.
Good times, good times.
With a much larger market to sell to, many devs see it as a good opportunity to introduce a game to a new audience that has a name they may have heard of. Second, people are running out of ideas. I would say this is more prevalent in modern Hollywood overall, but it's definitely trickling into the game industry too, especially AAA studios. I really don't know what it is, but people these days seem to have a complete lack of creativity. I'm sure it's a combination of corporate greed combined with laziness, as well as working in some pretty soulless environments. But regardless, it seems originality has become more of a treat rather than an expectation with a lot of modern media. Third, and most importantly, nostalgia sells. A lot of remakes coming out these days are of games that many of us grew up with and have very fond memories of. Seeing one of our old favorite games getting remade into something that looks as gorgeous as we imagined it looked when we were kids triggers something in our monkey brains that forces us to impulsively open our wallets. Well, at least that's really effective on me. So what makes a good or bad video game remake? I've identified three key qualities that tend to make a video game remake good. I'm basing this criteria off of my own opinion, but also of how general audiences have received these games, so that it's not quite completely subjective. The first and most obvious quality to what makes a good remake is how close it stays faithful to the original story of its source material. When people buy a remake of a game they used to love, it's pretty fair to assume they're expecting the same story that they loved, but presented in a much smoother and more intuitive gameplay style that modern gaming can offer. Emphasis on the can, because some games' mechanics have aged incredibly well and still hold up better than some modern game designs. I think a great example of this is the Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door remake. The game is incredibly faithful to the original, but adds in some gorgeous visuals and new gameplay mechanics that make the game less tedious overall. Like I said before, some game design philosophies do age very well, and they do not need fixing. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. The Mario RPG remake, similar to Thousand Year Door, is very faithful to the original, but I would say it very much is more of a visual rework to the original game, but leaves the original game design the same. For a game so iconic and tied to the early JRPG gameplay style as Mario RPG, this was the best approach they could have taken in my opinion. These two remakes were overall very well received by their respective fan bases for how faithful they were to their predecessors. Another interesting example I want to note is the Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary. When this game was announced, it received a lot of hype. The original Halo Combat Evolved was such a revolutionary game for really shaping the modern FPS genre. The remake of Halo CE was to release exactly 10 years after the original had, and had strongly advertised they would not make any changes to the original game except for upgrading the graphics. They even showcased that you could switch between the old and new graphics in real time at any point during the game. So if Halo CE was such a beloved game, and they weren't going to change how it played at all, then why was this game so controversial in the Halo community? Well, first of all, the game would only launch with the campaign, and then give you access to a few DLC multiplayer maps for Halo Reach. This made a lot of people upset because they were looking forward to playing Halo CE online, whether for the first time or to relive the days they had played it online via the PC port. The remake was also just stylistically awkward. Most of the weapons, enemies, and characters returned into the style of their Reach counterparts. This may have made sense in the continuity of the game, but it just seems so jarring for many longtime fans, especially blending the Reach style into a graphical style that was completely different than how Halo Reach looked. The result just made the graphics look really weird and off. A full price tag for a game with slightly better looking campaign and with a few DLC maps was unsurprisingly received with many mixed reactions from the community. 3 years later, Halo 2 Anniversary would release on the Xbox One as part of the Master Chief Collection. The Master Chief Collection was received horribly for many reasons which I won't get into, or else this video would be hours long. But specifically, the Halo 2 Anniversary was received quite positively. So what was the difference? Well, Halo 2 Anniversary actually shipped with its own full multiplayer mode and Forge that was inspired by the original Halo 2 multiplayer, but on the Halo 4 engine. But more importantly, Halo 2 Anniversary kept faithful to the original art style of Halo 2, while just upgrading the graphics and making everything much more detailed. This made the transition between classic and new graphics look much more natural. The game also had its cutscenes completely remade into pre-rendered cutscenes that look absolutely incredible. So where I'm starting to go with these last examples leads into my next criteria about what makes a good remake. Criteria number 2 is that good remakes should add upon their predecessors, while a good remake should definitely respect its source material. Fixing outdated controls, camera angles, and frustrating level designs should be an absolutely essential aspect to consider for any developer making a remake. In addition to fixes, good remakes should typically add new areas, features, unlockables, bonus modes, etc. Intuitive and creative updates like these can really bring a classic title to life for new and returning audiences. A remake that does this exceptionally well in my opinion is Persona 3 Reload. Persona 3 Reload fixes a lot of game mechanics that made the original game tedious and frustrating. The biggest and most noticeable change being the battle system and the main dungeon. In the original game, you cannot directly control your allies' actions in battles. You could only suggest tactics by which they should act. In the remake, this is still an option, but you can now also choose to directly control their actions if you wish. Along with this is the great changes they made to Tartarus, the game's main and only dungeon. Now, Tartarus is big, like 264 floors big. In the original, the scenery would change the higher you go, but it was mainly just dungeon crawling through randomly generated floor layouts. Reload introduced things like monad doors and monad gates, which contained mini-bosses and along with rare treasures. These changes, along with others, made exploring Tartarus feel much less tedious. Along with this, Reload also added more activities to do at nighttime, as the nights in the original game quickly became skipped with the lack of night activities there were. These are just some of the quality of life changes in Reload that I have the time to talk about. There are many more changes throughout the game that just make it a great way to experience the incredible story and characters of Persona 3 with modern Persona gameplay mechanics. Last but not least, criteria number 3 of what makes a good remake would be the visual style. Good remakes, obviously, upgrade their visuals from scratch. This is when many people can become emotionally charged upon seeing gameplay of a remake for the first time. Generally, if a remake's graphics/visual style don't match the expectations of how some players would have imagined it to look, they become very upset. This is an area where I think developers can really use their imaginations to their advantage. You can tell how much care goes into a remake by how they decided to make it look. This is always especially more evident when remaking much older games that used sprites or early 3D graphics into newer engines that can add so much more detail. Going back to Paper Mario and the Mario RPG remakes, they stayed very faithful to their original art styles, but you can really see how much care they put into making everything look so much more detailed and full of life. This is especially evident in Mario RPG, where they had to work from the original designs being sprites. Other great examples of criteria number 3 are the Resident Evil remakes. Capcom has been going hard on remaking their older titles, especially with the success of the Resident Evil 2 remake. Resident Evil series has some amazing remakes, except for Resident Evil 3. And I think part of what made them so successful is how gorgeous they look. The Resident Evil 2 remake is a complete reimagining of the original game, and now puts the player in an over-the-shoulder camera style instead of the traditional fixed camera angles. This already makes the game more accessible to newer fans, but also allows for much more detail to be added into areas of the game where they would have never been able to see before. The Resident Evil 4 remake also looks absolutely stunning. The attention to detail is incredible, as well as the environments and character designs.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
Visual design and art direction, believe it or not, is important to how one presents a story. It might not affect the quality of the storyline itself, but can greatly impact how a story is delivered to its intended audience. This is because a good visual design can influence how the audience emotionally reacts to what they're being presented with. For example, the art style and color palette used in Mario RPG in both versions of the game make it very attractive to look at. The bright colors and more cartoonish style evoke feelings of warmth and happiness, whereas the visual design of the Resident Evil 4 games is much less saturated. The style of these games is to make the player feel more on edge, anxious, and afraid. A complete change in visual design in a remake can completely change the intended tone and atmosphere that the developers were originally going for. For example, the remake of the original Call of Duty Zombies maps in Black Ops 3 for Zombies Chronicles, in my opinion, don't feel nearly as intense and scary as the original designs for these maps. The original maps have such an eerie atmosphere and gritty tone that the Black Ops 3 versions just tend to miss, in my opinion. So, what does make a good video game remake? In the 3 points I had mentioned, number 1, it stays faithful to the original story and vision of its predecessor. Number 2, it fixes gameplay elements or mechanics that are outdated or frustrating, as well as adds new content that complements the original version of the game rather than completely reinventing it. And number 3, it improves the graphics and visual style of the game. There are probably other details that go into what makes a remake good or bad, but these 3 categories I feel are the main criteria that go into good remake design. Using this metric, we can judge the overall quality of a remake and predict how it would be received by its community. As I mentioned previously, Halo CE Anniversary follows criteria 1 well by staying faithful to the original game, but I can't say that it follows number 2, as it doesn't really change or add much at all. And I don't even know if I can say it follows criteria 3 very well based on how they decided to change the art design. Super Mario RPG follows criteria 1 perfectly. It follows criteria 2 a little bit. It adds some new options to re-challenge the bosses and makes them much harder to fight, as well as some small quality of life changes. It also adds the level up dance, which is the greatest thing ever. It follows criteria 3 well in that the style remains the same, but the graphics are a huge upgrade. Paper Mario and the Thousand Year Door follows criteria 1, 2, and 3 almost perfectly in my opinion. Albeit it doesn't change or add a ton to the original game, but the things it does tweak make the gameplay a lot better and smoother than before. This one is a certified good remake. Resident Evil 4. I would say this one definitely follows criteria 2 and 3 well with how much of an upgrade this game looks and plays. Criteria 1 I would say follows pretty well, but there are some things that they change in the story I'm not a huge fan of. On the one hand, characters like Ashley and Krauser get a lot more development, which is awesome. But we also lose out on practically all screen time of Sadler, which is a huge bummer because he's the main villain. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a good example of a remake that was more poorly received, and in my opinion, it isn't a good remake. This game follows Criteria 3 well. I mean, it looks great. Criteria 2, it follows not super well. I mean, it follows it okay. It's the same gameplay style as the other Resident Evil remakes, which does play well. But Criteria 1 is where the game really falls off. The game is like 4 hours long. I literally beat this game the same night that I bought it on release, especially for a full AAA price tag.
That's it? That's the last episode? That was just a bunch of cheap walk cycles!
This one is not a great remake. Persona 3 Reload follows Criteria 1, 2, and 3 exceptionally well in my opinion. There's going to be controversy surrounding every remake, no matter what. There will always be people that claim the original is better than the remake. And I'm not necessarily saying that these are better than their original games per se, but I'm just using these criteria to judge if they are good standalone remakes themselves. Some of them I do prefer over the original games, but that's not what I'm necessarily here to talk about today. Finally, there is one remake that I want to discuss that does not follow any of these criteria, which makes it the worst remake of all of them.
Let's say that after 13 years of gaming innovation, a new GoldenEye game is coming up.
Oh my god! Yes!
But I think I'm going to make a full video on it in the future. So like and subscribe if you want to see me talk about it. Until next time, guys, peace out.